Chapter 10 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Craig. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Chapter 10. Robert Bruce. If you ask a Scot who is the greatest man that ever lived, he will probably say Robert Bruce. It does not matter that Robert Bruce died 600 years ago. His name is as bright in Scotland as though he had lived yesterday. Songs and stories are told about him there, and every schoolboy hears of him as soon as he is old enough to listen to the tales of his country. The reason for this is that Robert Bruce made the Scots free from the rule of England, which country they used to hate. Also because he was a great warrior, so strong in body and with such courage that it was almost impossible for any foe to stand against him. When Edward I ruled over England, he extended his power over the free land of Scotland, where the race and the speech were different from those of the English. A dispute had arisen among the Scottish chiefs as to who was to succeed to the Scottish throne. Many claimants came forward, and as a result of this the chieftains were embroiled among themselves, giving Edward a chance to seize their country, which he was not slow to take. So great had been the jealousy among the Scots that many joined Edward's army to fight against their fellow countrymen. Among them was a young nobleman named Robert Bruce, whose grandfather had himself been one of the claimants to the Scottish throne. It was not a noble deed on the part of Robert Bruce to serve under the English banner. Indeed, in his younger years, he does not seem to have been a hero at all. While the great Scottish chief Wallace was waging bitter war against King Edward, Bruce was content to rest under Edward's protection, even after Wallace was captured and put to a cruel death in Berwick Castle, where he was beheaded at Edward's order. At last, however, Bruce began to show that he intended to become a champion of the Scottish cause. He did not do this all at once, and in fact he acted treacherously both to the Scots and to the English, for he renounced his fealty to Edward on 2 separate occasions, and each time was won back to him and received gifts and forgiveness from him. At last, however, Bruce was obliged to fly for his life from the English court and trust his fortunes to the Scottish cause. He had been betrayed to Edward by a nobleman named Lord Comyn, and he was now determined that Comyn must be slain. He sent his 2 brothers as messengers to Comyn, asking this lord to accompany them to a church in Dumfries, where Bruce was waiting for him at the altar. When Comyn approached, Bruce told him that his treachery was discovered. "Be assured you shall have your reward," he cried loudly, and drawing his dagger he plunged it into Comyn's breast. Murder was little thought of in those days, but murder in a church, before the altar itself, and under the very eyes of the priests who were engaged in the religious offices, was a crime that made the whole civilized world ring with horror. And it blackened the name of Robert Bruce, with a stain that has lasted to this day, in spite of his great glory. Bruce, however, had been greatly provoked to this bloody deed, and was now to prove himself a true champion of the Scottish people. He sought safety in flight for a time, and at last rallied the Scots about him at Lochmaven Castle, from which place he told them that he would make himself king over all Scotland and liberate the land from the English. With his vassals and retainers about him, he issued proclamations for all who would fight against England to join his banner, and at Scone he had placed on his head the Scottish crown. When King Edward heard what Bruce had done, how he had murdered Comyn and been crowned king, and was inciting all of Scotland to rise against the English rule, he fell in such a rage that he could hardly speak for anger, and swore a great oath that the rest of his life should be devoted to punishing Bruce for his crimes. A strong English army was promptly raised and sent against the new Scottish king. The English soldiers under the Earl of Pembroke fell on the Scots at night in the woods at a place called Methven, when the followers of Bruce believed themselves to be safe from attack, and had taken off their armor. As the English with shouts and battle cries attacked the unguarded Scots, Bruce leaped to his horse, and with his great two-handed sword drove his enemies before him like chaff. But while the English recoiled before the blows of his powerful arm, they succeeded in routing his followers. A large number of Bruce's friends and retainers were captured, and he himself only escaped by killing with his own hand 3 men who laid hold of his equipment and were trying to drag him from his horse. For the time being, the Scots were thoroughly defeated and were obliged to take shelter wherever they could find it. With his army scattered and only about 500 followers remaining faithful to him, Bruce fled into the mountain forest of Athole. His troubles had only begun, for many fierce Scottish noblemen themselves were his bitter enemies on account of wars between the different Scottish clans, and particularly because of the foul murder of Lord Comyn. Then began a period of wandering and suffering for Bruce and his followers. They made their way across the mountains to Aberdeen, where their wives joined them, preferring to be hunted outlaws with their husbands rather than to remain in safety away from them. And finally the little band of ragged Highlanders came to Argyle, where they were confronted in battle by a Scottish chief called John of Lorne. Bruce's men were in poor condition on account of the hardships they had undergone, and were also outnumbered by their enemies. The result of the battle was a second defeat for Bruce, who now must hide more closely than ever, as his enemies were hunting for him everywhere. Once more his wife had to part from him, for his state was now so dangerous and the hardships he endured so great that no woman could withstand them. And the lords who remained in his company had likewise to say farewell to their wives and children. No spot in Scotland was safe for them. Nowhere could Bruce rest his head and be sure that his enemies would not attack him before morning. English soldiers and Scots who had become their allies were looking for him everywhere. Moreover, those Scots who fell into the hands of the enemy could not hope for mercy. If they were men of low degree and with no title of nobility, they were hanged. If they were of noble birth, they suffered the more aristocratic fate of beheading. Still further misfortunes were to follow Bruce. The Pope could not forget his desecration of the Church, and passed on him what is known to all followers of the Catholic faith as the sentence of excommunication. This was a terrible punishment, for it meant that so far as the power of the Church went, and that power was absolute in those far days, Bruce could never be received in heaven, or even have the privilege of repenting for his sins. He was cast out of the Church into the outer darkness, and the hands of every priest and of all righteous men were turned against him. He was obliged to flee to a little island off the coast of Ireland, where with a few followers he had a comparatively safe hiding place, although the ships of King Edward were hunting for him high and low. In the meantime his queen and her ladies, whom he believed he had sent to a safe refuge in a small stronghold called Kildrummy Castle, were captured by the English and kept in close confinement, being made to undergo many indignities because Bruce himself has succeeded in eluding vengeance. But all the time he lay in concealment, Bruce considered how he could go back to Scotland, whose shores he could see from his hiding place, and he and his followers were constantly making desperate plans to return. Chief among them was one James Douglas, who was a brave and noble warrior, second only to Bruce himself in the strength of his arm, and no way inferior to him in the quality of his courage. After many a talk with Douglas and the rest of his followers as to what would be best for them in their extremity, Bruce decided to send a trusty messenger in a small boat to the Scottish shore to learn if there was any discontent under the British rule, and if the time for a second uprising had not perhaps arrived. For Bruce knew he had many friends, if he could only reach them and gather them to his side. The messenger who made this dangerous journey was to signal to Bruce if it was safe for him to return, by lighting a beacon fire in the headland that was most visible from the island of Arran, where Bruce was then hiding. If Bruce saw the fire on the following night, he and his followers were to embark at once for Scotland. There they would be met by friends, and their further course made clear to them. How great was Bruce's joy when the night fell to see the beacon fire spring up on the distant headland. With a high heart, he and his followers embarked and pulled strongly at the oars. They believed that Scotland would be theirs again. But when Bruce and his small band of followers arrived on the mainland, they found the messenger awaiting them. It seemed that some ill chance had befallen, for the beacon had been kindled by accident, and for some other purpose than to call Bruce from his hiding place. So far from being prepared for his invasion, Scotland seemed more dangerous than ever for him. Two of his brothers had been captured by the English, and both had been beheaded. Bruce learned also that the Queen and her ladies, whom he believed to be safe in Kildrummy Castle, had fallen into English hands and were pent in dungeons like wild beasts. Discretion told the little band of adventurers to return to their island retreat, but after consulting together over their bitter fortunes, they decided to make a bold stroke for success, and die if it did not succeed. An English garrison lay at Turnberry Castle not far off, and had been divided in two parts, one being billeted in a nearby village while the other occupied the castle itself. It was decided to attack the English soldiers who were in the village and not to leave a man of them alive. Silently Bruce and his men stole up to the little town. As the frightened English came running half-clad into the streets, they were met by the swords and axes of the Scots. Few escaped the grim vengeance of that attack, and Bruce retaliated heavily for the injuries the English had worked on his wife and his kinsmen in his absence. The Scots, however, did not rally to Bruce's standard as quickly as he hoped, and he was once more compelled to take shelter in the mountains. To escape the enemies who fell on his little band in far superior numbers and with better arms and equipment, he was obliged to flee as swiftly as possible. His enemies, however, had tracked Bruce himself by a bloodhound, and it seemed impossible for him to escape the unerring scent of this terrible animal, which picked up his trail from among those of his followers. At last, with a few men, he separated entirely from his soldiers, telling them of a rendezvous where they were to meet him in case he should escape. Bruce avoided the bloodhound by wading through a running stream, and then had adventures which have become the subject of legends in his country. At one time he was ambushed and attacked by 3 traitors of his own force, who hoped to make their fortunes by bringing his head to the English. Instead of this, they dug their own graves, for Bruce slew all 3 with his own hand. On another occasion he took refuge with a single companion in a deserted house where 3 more enemies endeavored to kill him as he slept. Bruce had a companion at his side, but both were worn out by the hardships they had undergone and were fast asleep as the ruffians with drawn swords and daggers stole upon them. The good angel of Scotland made one of them tread too heavily. All at once Bruce awoke and leaped to his feet with his mighty 2-handed sword in his grasp. His companion was slain, but alone Bruce struck down and killed the 3 murderers that had set upon him. There are many stories about Bruce while he lay hiding in the mountain fastnesses of Scotland. We are told that on the day following his victory over the 3 would-be assassins, he went to the house of an old woman and asked for something to eat. And when he begged for food, she replied that she would give it to him willingly for the sake of one wanderer that she loved. And Bruce inquired of her who that might be. "No other than King Robert himself," she responded. "He is hunted now and without friends, but the time will come when he shall rule all Scotland." "Know then, woman," said Bruce, overjoyed at this evidence of devotion that had followed him in his trouble, "that I am he of whom you speak, and have returned for no other purpose than to resume my crown and throne." When the old woman recovered from her amazement, she did him reverence as the rightful king of Scotland, and called in her 3 strong sons to wait on him and join the ranks of his soldiers. Bruce slowly collected the men that remained faithful to him, and at Loudon Hill in May he and his followers met an English army. The English leader, whose name was de Valence, had done everything in his power to make Bruce come forth from his mountain retreat and do battle with the English. for he believed that on open ground he could defeat the Scots decisively and do away with the long chase of Bruce that was wearying himself and his followers. So De Valence sent Bruce a letter in which he called him a base coward for refusing to meet him in battle, and challenged Bruce to stand up to him as a soldier at Loudon on the 10th of May. Stung with anger, Bruce accepted the challenge, and the crafty English leader rejoiced because his enemy had delivered himself into his hands. Bruce, however, had no intention of being defeated. He arrived on the appointed spot several days before the English and studied his ground with the eye of a trained general. He knew the route that must be taken by the English, and so arranged his forces that it would be impossible for his enemies to outflank him, entrenching himself behind marshes and ditches that the English could not pass. On the appointed day, he saw the gay banners and shining armor of his enemies. They approached recklessly and hurled themselves against his line in a headlong charge, but the Scots held firm. Again and again the English sought to break the Scottish ranks or to take them on the flank, but to no avail. And then when their ranks showed signs of wavering, Bruce himself gave the signal for the charge. With a shout his men rushed forward and the English were routed. Victory had crowned the arms of a tattered and ragged band of outlaws who fought with English halters around their necks. Then a terrible calamity befell the English and turned the scale still further in favor of Bruce. Old King Edward, embittered because his cherished schemes regarding Scotland had failed, died, and with his last breath he asked his son, the Prince of Wales, to see his bones were carried in their coffin at the head of an English army invading Scotland. The Prince of Wales who succeeded him was called Edward II, and was a hollow echo of his father's greatness. While Edward had been the finest general of his time, either in England or in Europe, the new king knew little of military art and was idle and of a pleasure-loving nature. He knew nothing of generalship and cared less, being content to leave the leading of his armies in the field to the nobles who served him. At once it was seen that the death of the strong King Edward I was a great stroke of good fortune for his equally strong opponent. In the 2 years that followed King Edward's death, nearly the whole country of Scotland rose against the English and threw off the foreign yoke, acclaiming Bruce as their rightful king. Border warfare was constant, and raids and skirmishes were carried on both by the Scots and the English, with varying success on either side. In these raids, sieges, and forays, one of Bruce's followers particularly distinguished himself. This was James Douglas, who had shared all his leader's hardships. While most of Scotland was now under Bruce's banner, the English still held many important strongholds which were thorns in the side of Bruce and his followers. Chief among these fortresses were those of Stirling and Berwick. Realizing that the overthrow of these strong fortresses was necessary to the success of the Scottish cause, King Robert in the autumn of 1313 sent his brother Edward Bruce to lay siege to Stirling Castle. So well did the Scots succeed, and so ruthlessly did they beset the strong walls of Stirling, that at last the English commander, one Sir Philip Mowbray, agreed to surrender, providing the besieged soldiers were not relieved by the English before the 24th of June of the following year. This was a strange arrangement, and showed that the old laws of chivalry which bound all noblemen to certain forms of warfare and certain conditions of fighting were still in operation. But the English had no intention of allowing Stirling Castle to fall into the hands of the Scots, and before the stipulated date a strong army advanced into Scotland, led by King Edward II in person. It numbered, we are told, about 100,000 men, while the total number that Bruce was able to muster was 30,000, so that his force of seasoned veterans was compelled to fight at odds of more than 3 to 1. Bruce sent out scouts to keep close watch of all the English movements, and on the 22nd of June they brought him word that the English were advancing on Stirling Castle by way of a place called Falkirk. This information enabled Bruce to know exactly how his enemies must travel, for to reach Stirling after passing Falkirk they would have to cross a stream called Bannock Burn, and Bruce was thoroughly acquainted with the country in the vicinity of this stream. He assembled his army on its bank and strengthened his position with hundreds of pits in which sharp stakes were planted to trip and impale the English cavalry. When these pits were prepared, they were covered up again with turf in such a way that they were practically invisible. Bruce also took his position at a ford in the river, knowing that his flanks would be protected by deep water and high banks so that the enemy could not get around him. When his men had taken their positions, he spoke to them. He told them that the hour had come when they were to make Scotland free or die as they faced the foe. If the men did not like his conditions, he continued, they were free to depart before the battle began. But the Scots stood firm. Although they had an idea of the odds against which they must fight, their confidence in their leader was so great that they had no doubt in their minds that victory would be theirs. Behind their reed fortifications, with sharpened pikes and swords, they awaited grimly the coming of Edward's horsemen. The battle opened in a curious manner. While Sir Thomas Randolph, one of Bruce's kinsmen, was fighting with a body of English cavalry that sought to outflank Bruce and make its way to Stirling Castle, Bruce himself engaged in single combat with an English knight named Sir Henry de Bohun. This knight had recognized Bruce as the latter rode up and down in front of the line of Scottish warriors, and spurring his horse with lance in rest, he charged at the Scotch king. Bruce was only mounted on a small pony, while the Englishman rode a heavy charger, but when the knight was upon him, Bruce, by a deft twist of the bridle, avoided the deadly lance, and in another second had driven his battle-axe through the skull of his enemy with so mighty a blow that the handle broke in his hand. A great cheer arose from the Scottish ranks as they beheld this deed, and with the greatest bravery they routed the English as they charged. The English had not reckoned on such stubborn resistance from a force far inferior to their own, both in size and equipment, and as the day was waning they withdrew in good order, planning to hold a council of war and gain the battle on the following day. Early in the morning the Scots were in position, and with a great rush of horses and men the English surged upon them. It was to no avail. Again and again the flower of the English nobility charged the squares of Scottish infantry and were driven back in confusion. At last the English lines wavered, and with a deafening cheer the Scots rushed upon them. Pell-mell the English retreated, and the battle was won. It is said that 30,000 Englishmen were slain in this encounter, a number equal to the total number of the Scottish army. The victory that Bruce won at the Battle of Bannockburn changed the entire course of English history. Instead of being a hunted fugitive, he was now acknowledged as king and openly received the fealty of his subjects. The English strongholds in Scotland were overthrown, and Scotland became a kingdom in fact as well as in name. Moreover, Bruce's wife and daughter, who had been imprisoned in England, were set at liberty. Fighting was not yet over, however, and border warfare for a time continued with varying success on either side. Edward Bruce, the brother of King Robert, was killed when fighting in Ireland. In 1328 a treaty was signed with England in which the English recognized that Scotland was now fairly entitled to her independence and that Bruce was her rightful ruler. But the great king was not to enjoy for long the fruits of his victory. His hardships in the wilderness when flying from his enemies, and his great suffering and lack of food when he fled in the Scotch heather like a hunted animal, had made him fall prey to a terrible malady, the disease of leprosy. So great was the love in which the Scots held him that even this did not make them shun him with the fear that is shown toward ordinary sufferers from this disease. Surrounded by friends, Bruce gradually wasted away and died in 1329. His noble follower Douglas, who had won the name from the English of the Black Douglas, took the heart of the dead king and placed it in a silver box, planning to carry it to Jerusalem. But Douglas himself did not live to place it there, for he was killed in a battle with the Moors. In all history there have been great soldiers and chiefs of Scottish birth. How great the Scots are as soldiers has been shown in the recent war, where they rendered the most distinguished service for Great Britain, fighting under the British flag, their former quarrels with England reconciled, if not forgotten. But of all, none was more glorious than Robert Bruce, and his name is a household word today through the whole of Scotland. End of chapter 10.